beyond that, just so you know. So today's big point. I'm assuming by now you know what your discourse community is. I think after last week, everyone was going to end the week by knowing. I bet a lot of you already have a good number of notes, things that you've noticed about things that make them a discourse community, or just things that make them interesting, things that will help you kind of share an essay about, hey, check out this interesting stuff about this interesting group. That's kind of the underlying feel of this essay, is like teaching all of us about a group we might not know about. And yet I feel like sometimes there's the problem, how do you do that smoothly? How do you do that clearly? How do you organize all that crap and turn it into an essay? So that's really the key today. I want to get really particular about advice about how you might want to shape your body paragraphs. You're not your intro, not your conclusion, but kind of the in-between paragraphs. So with that said, I'm going to walk through a number of steps today. And the first step is one that shouldn't be a surprise after what we talked about last week and Wednesday and on Friday. Uh, Hopefully you've started to think about how to classify all your notes. That was the whole point last week, right? How to classify, how to label, how to name kind of what you found, how to group it together, how to chunk it together. And you can see over here on the left, I'm sorry, over here on the right, I've got a few ways that I could imagine doing that, right? Maybe I can imagine my discourse community is informal in some ways and they're formal in other ways. Maybe my discourse welcomes newcomers in some ways and leaders protect newcomers. So it's kind of different, right? But they're both about newcomers in some way. Maybe I have two different chunks of evidence about specialized language. So maybe there's specialized language that everyone can understand that my discourse community use, but maybe there's other stuff that would really be kind of hard to learn, that they really have to be taught. Of course, you can have more classifications. Your essay doesn't have to have two classifications, but just for simplicity right now, I wonder if you have at least two, and I wonder if you could share them. This is the one and only time I'm going to ask you to share in the chat. But if you can find the chat place, I'm going to be quiet for 2 or 3 minutes and give you a chance to just kind of say, well, I'm thinking maybe I could have a chunk that's on this and a chunk like this. Two that came up in my last class is that someone was talking about a certain kind of fans. And they said, well, I'm going to have a section where I talk about the qualities of diehard fans and the qualities of kind of the fans that really are kind of newer to the fandom. Those are both part of his discourse community, but they're kind of like sub classifications, different ways of zooming in. And that was a great example. That's totally fine. So let me be quiet and ask you to actually type, really, actually for real, your thoughts about two classifications at least. Jackson, I like your idea of newbie weightlifters versus experienced. I think you could definitely imagine the taking notes on qualities that the newbies tend to say and do and talk and how they act and believe versus the experienced ones. That makes sense. I am going to pause on this like an awkwardly long time because to do the rest of the things for the rest of this assignment, we're really going to have some sort of an idea. Dina's asking, what do we have to do right now? It's what it says on the left side of the screen there. Think of, you've got all these ideas about, in your case, it's your family, right? So what are some of, if you had to group the ideas you have about your family, what are the groups that you would have? And now you have some examples of how you might group them. Grace is also talking kind of a newbie versus experience split that makes a lot of sense for certain kinds of discourse communities, maybe not for everyone's. Uh, I like how you break it down, kind of what sort of things would make you call someone an experience. Well, kind of if they have popularity, if they have experience, it's um, that sort of thing. Um, Dina might group into the people that you actually see, the brothers and sisters versus our parents. Um, yeah, I do think that I think the best way to classify, and this kind of goes for all of you, is that if you're the one kind of giving it a creative name, uh, do you remember last week we looked at a sample from a student who I called Will, and Will kind of he labeled 4 different groups he saw on the basketball team, and he kind of said, well, there's the returners, and there's the he kind of he named it. Uh, the idea is that we're thinking of you're going to have a whole bunch of stuff, but you're going to have to break it down. You're going to have to talk about certain kinds of things in different orders. So the idea is, what's one of those orders? What's one of those possible chunks? And there's all sorts of ways to do it. I see Avin's writing, let me read this really quick. By MT, he means musical theater, I'm sure. People are just coming into the program, folks who are doing it. So again, there's kind of a newbie versus experience thing kind of coming on. I like that. Let me actually continue on, because I think this will make more sense when we start to see what I'm asking you to do with this. And in some ways, what I'm asking you to do is kind of outline your essay. And in some ways, I think each of the classifications, each of the labels, each of the chunks you have will end up being its own paragraph, or maybe it's its own larger section that might include multiple paragraphs. But let me show you step 2, and I think this will make sense. I do want to ask you to pick a focus for today, to choose one of those classifications. So maybe just newcomers, or maybe experienced people, or whatever. Hopefully someone that you have a piece of evidence that we can kind of pretend that you want to write about. Ideally, you're thinking about a quotation. I know you might be like, what is all this stuff? I don't have notes, I don't have a quotation. Well, remember, we talked about that last week, that one requirement, oh, sorry guys, I dropped my keyboard. Let me get back to that really quick. I can show you. All right. Back to this slide. In this essay, you are required to have a quotation, right? So maybe you have some already. Maybe you found some good lines online that you're like, ooh, here's someone who said this. Or maybe you have like an old text that you want to use. Or maybe you overheard something. Or maybe you interviewed someone. If you don't have a quotation, something you notice could be good enough. For instance, I'm going to focus today on my hypothetical example of faculty in the College of Arts and Humanities. I keep using this in all my classes. And let's say I want to focus my classification, the one that I chose from slide 1, is ways that these faculty are informal. Now later I might have other examples of how they're formal, but today let's focus on the informal. Let's write a paragraph about proving that these faculty are actually fit this label, this classification that I've given them. And let's say that to do this essay that I went around and talked to people. Like I went to Professor Jenkins, who's a real professor in the English department, and let's say that she told me this. Now it's a fake quote, I made it up just for today, but let's pretend that she said this and I wrote it down, or maybe I emailed her and said, hey, Professor Jenkins, can I ask you about what it's like to be in this discourse community? And let's say she wrote this to me. And that's definitely something I could use to prove the classification. So what I'm asking you to do right now, and again, I'm going to be quiet for a second. You can use the chat if you want to clarify with me if you want, or you can ask out loud. But I want you to look through your notes or look through your memory and find what's something that you could write about for today. What's a piece of evidence, a quote or an observation or something that you see all the time? And maybe that will help you kind of give your label. So for instance, since so many of you are talking about newcomers versus experienced people, let's say you're all going to write a paragraph proving that the newcomers in your discourse community have particular traits. So when I say a single piece of evidence, what I mean is, what's one thing that you would say that newcomers have? What's a thing that they do or they show, or a way that they let on that they're newcomers? That's the piece of evidence that I'm looking for today. That's where I think, like, if the example is just Um, this is where I think it's easier if you're the one who's putting this label on. So if it's just like my siblings versus my parents, there isn't really evidence to prove to us that they are your siblings or parents. Like that's just how they are. But maybe if one of the qualities that you want to talk about in your family is everyone jokes a lot. So maybe your classification is all the ways that my discourse community uses jokes. Okay, well then an evidence would be a joke you heard someone say. Or what if one thing that you want to notice is that everyone in my discourse community um, um, likes to be together, and they don't like having outsiders come in. All we want is just our extended family. So the classification would be ways that we exclude outsiders and ways that we kind of are internal. And an evidence would be maybe one time my grandma said, I don't like people in there. Or maybe the doors are always locked, or who knows. So again, let me pause for a second and let you try to find those. And again, hop into the chat. You can chat with all of us. You can chat just with me if you're not sure about how to choose this focus. Give you about one more minute to kind of just think about it. You don't have to share this part. You can do this privately. But you do have to choose something because all the writing we're about to do is going to be based on what you choose right now. If you don't have something chosen, just make something up for now.
I have a question.
Oh, that's great. Let me really quickly answer Grace's point. I'll just say it out loud that Grace, I do think that that's perfect. I like the idea of having a specific quote from them is great. But again, there's a newcomer trait that they don't feel like they're very good. Kind of like I just typed in response to Jackson's. It's kind of there's also the feeling of like, remember the underlying purpose of this essay is to kind of share interesting things. So to some extent, just saying, hey, newcomers don't know how to do things. I think for both of you, there's a degree to which I see that as a starting point. It kind of sounds like, oh yeah, sure, of course they don't. Um, but is there anything more surprising? Is there anything like, and yet, because it's a discourse community, when they feel confused, they reach out in this way, or they pull this out, or they do this, or they say this. I don't know what it is because I don't know your discourse communities, but I would always be looking for the stuff that a reader might go, huh, that's kind of cool. I never would have noticed that. Uh, Sorry, Jackson, just wanted to answer that because it came in first.
Could I use myself as an example? Like for instead of using a quote, could I just use like my experience?
I think so, as long as it's a specific experience. So like the practice today is going to be how to essentially to build up to a detail. So if your experience is like, if you can start it with like, for example, or one day I walked in and I noticed this thing happening and this is what happened. This is what I saw. This is how I felt. Then that's okay. That counts.
All right.
Cool. Let me keep going. So hopefully you've got some sort of idea of a focus. You've got some idea of a piece of evidence. If not, go back and watch this video later, or take notes. But here's step 3. I want us to actually write the paragraph, like right now during the class. I'm going to keep pausing, and I'm not going to ask you to share this. You can do this just completely on your own. You can share it with me later if you want. Um, but I want you to imagine that you're in the essay. Let's imagine you've already got an introduction, and that's what this dot, dot, dot up here means. And you're now getting to the paragraph where you're like, all right, I've introduced my discourse community. I've introduced all this stuff my reader might need to know. Let's talk about the particular part. Let's talk about this particular classification. In my case, let's talk about how this group of faculty are informal. Maybe you guys want to talk about, you want to prove that certain there are certain interesting things about a newcomer group, or about a particular quality that you notice in your discourse community. So what I want you to do is actually write a sentence or two that tells your reader what's up. I don't want you to get to the evidence yet. I don't want you to say, don't start with your quote. Don't start with your story. Don't start with the details. Take a step back first and be like, hey, hold on. Here's the main thing we're going to get to. And I think the ideal world is that when you start this paragraph, when you tell us what's up, you also do some judging, some assessing, some kind of tell us if this is a good thing or not. So you can see my example over here, right? Let me just read it to you. I won't do this every time, but as I observed this group of faculty, one theme surfaced repeatedly. Even though these are professionals with lots of degrees, they're also very informal. Okay, so I made that yellow to say there's no way a reader could be thrown off. They know now this is going to be the informal paragraph, right? That's what's going to be here. Proof of the ways these faculty are informal. Um, Often I put that kind of stuff at the end of a sentence because that's kind of it's a really emphasis place. That's where people will remember it. Blah, 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 blah. They're also, boom, boom. They're also very informal. But then I didn't have that judgment yet. It was unclear to my reader if I thought that was a good thing or not. It's like, should faculty be informal? So I threw in some judgment. This informality walks the line between being a strength and a weakness. In other words, it's kind of both and. I'd say that some students find the informality useful while others are turned away from it. So I want to actually ask you on your own paper, in another window, whatever, try starting the paragraph that talks about the classification you chose. If it doesn't seem to work, if it doesn't seem to fit right now, choose a different classification. Um, I do notice that a lot of what we're doing right now is we're talking about, I think one possible misunderstanding is that all of the ones that you all here shared with me are like subgroups. Like, here's my discourse community, and then here's smaller groups underneath it. Let me introduce you to that subgroup. That doesn't have to be the case. Um, I'm talking about this whole group of arts and humanities faculty, and I'm going to talk about how they're all informal, and I'll have another paragraph where they're all formal. So this doesn't have to be a classifying the people. It's a label of, you're classifying the evidence. You're classifying the stuff that you've noticed about them. How some of the stuff I saw makes me draw this conclusion, and some things I noticed about them makes me draw this other conclusion. So again, let me be quiet. Again, type in the chat if you want some help on this, but try to start a paragraph. One sentence at least, maybe two. Give you about 30 more seconds to try that. As you write this, I wonder if you might be starting to understand the difference in my mind between the ideas score and the organization score. Uh, the organization score is starting your paragraph in a way that's very clearly states what's going to happen and that kind of sets up what your judgment or assessment of the topic is. Um, the idea score is more, not necessarily are you making that move, but are you making that move about interesting points that a reader might not have thought of. So it's like one is just did you guide us in the right way, and the other thing is did you guide us in a way that's really interesting. But from that, let's move on to the evidence score, which is a new score that wasn't part of your literacy narrative. Let's assume now you've got some kind of topic sentence. Again, if you don't right now, that's okay. You can work on it later. But let's talk about step 4, which is getting into the quote sandwich. I know we really briefly introduced this in all of my classes last week, but mostly it was just kind of like, okay, this is on the sheet, right? We're going to mention it really fast next week. You know this happened. So hopefully the phrase makes sense. Remember, the basic idea of the quote sandwich is that when you bring up evidence, especially quotations, but this actually works for summaries or other kind of evidence or stories from yourself too. Um, the idea is that to do this smoothly, to let people really understand what you mean and for to feel natural, it makes sense to get into your evidence, share the evidence, and then explain the evidence. So it's kind of the stuff on both sides of the quote itself. So let's just try it, right? Hopefully you identified a story or a quotation or something earlier when we were prepping this a minute ago. And I want you to just try actually writing the sentence that is going to introduce the evidence. Now, don't actually share it yet. So, like, I have a quote from Professor Jen Jenkins, but I'm not going to actually give the quote yet. So, don't actually have like, don't say, don't tell your story yet. Just give us a little bit of the like, hey guys, what I'm about to tell you is this, and here's kind of why I'm going to tell you, and here's how you should interpret what I'm about to tell you. That's why I wrote down here, it's best to continue to introduce and assess, to judge and to assess. So you see in mind, I use that simple phrase, for example. It's not the only phrase, but something like that is really helpful to kind of switch into, I was in big picture mode, and now I'm switching into the quote. So it's the top red. And in this example, I tell you, hey, I had a conversation with Professor Jenkins, and she shared an informal perspective that could only be perceived as a good thing by students. That's that judgment and assessment. That's where I'm saying, I'm going to share something that I think if you're a student, you're going to like. So try that. Try writing. You probably only need one sentence, maybe even just a phrase, to kind of uh, build up to the evidence you're about to share with your reader. As I say a lot of times, there are a lot of ways to do this right. This is a general template that will often help you, but you might be in places where you're like, this feels so restricting. So don't hear me say this is the only way to write. Uh, but I do think thinking about what your reader might want to know before you give them the evidence is a good idea. So let's keep moving here. So that's step 4, the top bread. You can probably guess step 5 is the meat, or the veggies if you're a vegetarian. It's the middle, it's the actual evidence, it's the quote or kind of the summary of it itself. And you see in mine, the part that I just shared is still here. Like if I go back to the last slide, this was the top red. It's starting with the yellow she said. That's where I kind of actually get into the actual quotation itself. Let me briefly give you two suggestions about how to get into quotations especially well if you have a quote. I know you might not have one right now, but you definitely will have a quote at least once in your essay. That's a requirement. So two ways to kind of smoothly do this, and I'm especially thinking of like the grammar and the punctuation. What I did here was the really common verb, comma, space, right? There's a verb said, a comma, and then a space, and then the quote itself. Like she said, he suggested, they disagreed by saying. There's a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of ways to do it right. My point is that if the thing before the quote is a verb, 90% of the time, the correct punctuation is a comma. It's really safe to assume that. Now, sometimes you'll find yourself writing and you're like, I don't want a verb right before it. And the time that happens to me is when I have a complete sentence before, not just like a phrase like she said, he suggested, they disagree with saying. It's when I have like a whole sentence, like she said something horrible. You see how that could be a complete sentence, right? She said something horrible. Then I use a colon. And you see the colon is the one that has two dots. It's not the semicolon with the dot in the period. The two dots says the thing that comes after that colon is the thing I just prepped you for. He suggested an obvious point, colon, the obvious point. Either of those are fine. There are plenty of other good ways to get in, but these are kind of the most common. So again, let me give you a second. I'll give you a little less time this time because you've already written the top red, which I think is the hard part. Now it's just like, give us the thing that you just prepped us for. So again, try writing that sentence to build up to it. Try giving that sentence to actually share the quotation. So hopefully you've got something there. Again, even if it's not a quote, you've at least got a summary. You've brought up the thing that you've been building up to. It really is appropriate to think of this as like your notes, your data, your evidence, your quotes, your observations are in some ways the core part of this essay, but everything else, the way you surround them is really what matters. The way you help us understand what to do with that, how you want us to understand them. So let me show you just a couple of things while we're still in step 5. 5 little grammatical punctuation ways that people often mess up getting into quotes. Again, whether you did this just now or whether this is for later. So these are suggestions that you not do. I often see people use a verb with a colon. Now, I'm not going to say that's like 100% wrong. I have seen published writing that does this. But I think it's, in general, it's not necessary. If you want to talk to me later about why you feel like you really need a colon after a verb like that, fine. But if you have something like that, she said, I would always urge you to use a comma instead. It's much more common, much more usual. I do see people who forget the spacing. They'll kind of jam things together. I see that especially with people who aren't from the US, who aren't used to using our system of quotation marks. That makes so much sense. You have your own great system. In US writing, there's always that space before the quotation marks. I'll see people just leave off anything. They won't make the colon mistake. They'll just make the nothing mistake. Again, that's also incorrect. It almost makes it a run-on to just like zoom straight in. You need kind of like a pause. You need a little bit of a breather. Again, that's not in every single case, but if there's a verb before it, it definitely is. I'll see people do the entire sentence thing, and then they'll use a comma instead of a colon. Remember, if this part could be read as a complete sentence, she said something horrible, you need the colon to kind of tell us Well, what is it? The thing about to come is that. And finally, I'll see people do the same thing, the complete sentence, the period ends, and then they'll start the next sentence with a quote. I want to urge you, this again, this isn't a rule always, but it's a really good guideline. If you have a quotation in academic writing, don't start your sentence with a quotation. Always give us, some people call it a tag. Always give us the she said or the that, or the build up, that she said something horrible. Now, this doesn't apply to all writing. In creative writing, you'll have so many places where you use dialogue, where people will talk and people will start sentences with quotation marks. So this isn't in all situations, but I think in academic writing, in most cases, you build up to it. You don't just like say it, boom, period, and then you get into it. It feels like a bump. It feels like a speed bump. Like we're reading along and then, poof, oh, we ended. It's smoother again to use the colon or to use the comma. So if you did one of those just now, fix it right now. You just wrote a sentence. Great. Uh, One last thing before we move to step 6. You will somewhere in your essay be referring to the Meltzer article. That's a requirement, right? One of the main big points of this essay is to prove the things I'm telling you about my discourse community fit what Dan Meltzer said. So maybe that'll even help you kind of choose a classification system for your different paragraphs. So if you're quoting from him rather than from your own notes, you got to give a page number, which makes sense, right? There's no page number for the notes that you have in an email or that you heard someone say or that you observed online. Um, but if you're taking it from a published piece like this that like specifically has a page number, let us know where you got it. The simplest way to do that is by simply doing it like this. You, instead of putting the period, you put the quotation, you put the page numbers in parentheses and you put the period here. Let me go back really quick. You notice here the period was always inside the quote, period, 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 here. That's correct. In the US, we always put the periods and the commas inside the quotation marks. It's the most common thing that I think people mistake. This is not universal in every country, but in the US, we always do. There's one exception. The exception is here. The time you don't put the period inside is when you have a page number in a parentheses. Then it goes outside. Think of the period as almost like it's almost like a gate. It's almost saying, all right, everything before that's part of this sentence, everything after that's the next sentence. And of course, the period needs to include that page number as part of the gate. Of course, that's part of the thing there. Uh, you might have had a teacher who tells you, no, you should put Meltzer 68 in there. You should put the last name of the person too. You honestly don't need that if it's clear in your sentence where you got it. If your sentence says Meltzer writes, and we already know, don't say Meltzer again in the parentheses. That's overkill, I'm not going to be super picky about this. That's more of a RHET 102, RHET 351 later classes issue. But for now, that's a really good basic rule to follow. Hope that makes sense. Okay, you've got your top red, you've got the middle, you know what's coming, right? Step 6 is the bottom red. So the point here, the bottom red is to me the most commonly missed. In my mind, it's almost the most important, and it's the thing that most often people are like, I probably don't need that. What you're doing is you're telling your reader, hey reader, I just gave you something, I just gave you some evidence, and I already kind of told you a little bit about what I thought about it. Let me kind of make it clear now. Now that you've read it, now that you've seen it, let me clarify. It's almost like if you were showing a video to someone. Before you show the video, you'd say, hey, let me show you something really funny. Top red, right? Then you show the video, then afterwards you're like, okay, here's what was so great about that. But there's some things you can only say after they've seen the video. They can't quite get it until they've seen it, until they've heard the evidence. So that's what the bottom red is. It's a chance to explain. So what I've got here on the right is, of course, the actual evidence itself. And then I use the phrase, notice how, and you can read it yourself. I don't have to read it at you, but notice this thing that I want to tell you about that quote. I gave you a few other quotes that might work for you. Those are phrases you can steal from me if you want, or adjust or remix however you want. But give that a shot. Tell your reader why the evidence you just shared is important or interesting or helps prove something that you want us to know. I think it's possible that you won't be able to do this until later. You notice my last phrase that might help is, this contradicts another piece of evidence. You might only be able to do this once you've kind of got a sense of what all is going to go in your paragraph. That is okay. What's important though is that eventually in the version you turn in, you do this. You follow your quotes with explanation with bottom bread. Now, what I would do normally, I don't think we have time to do right now, is I would transition into more evidence. I mean, think about it. If this paragraph is proving to you that RU faculty in this college are informal, one quote from one professor doesn't prove that. That's one quote from one professor. So to prove to you that we're actually informal, you'd have to have more quotes. Well, I also noticed this. I also heard this. I also saw this. You probably have a whole collection of ways that prove the thing you're trying to say in this paragraph. So it's up to you. You might decide to bring that up in another paragraph, kind of like part 2 of informality. You might, in other words, have multiple paragraphs doing a single thing, or maybe not. Maybe in this paragraph, I want to transition into the next one. You can see if we go back, my notice how was kind of my bottom bread sentence, and I kind of have that ending here. So really moving on here is kind of, it's almost like a mix. Things get messier as paragraphs go on. It's almost a mix of more bottom bread with transition with top bread for the next part. Let me just read it really quick. That student-centered purpose appears repeatedly when this faculty group shows signs of informality. Even though it doesn't come across well to all students, it's at least clear that when these faculty are informal, they think they're doing it for the students. But another example hints at informality's problems. Like really what I know that I have more info with informality. It's more evidence of the same thing, but it's evidence that I judge differently. And I'm kind of transitioning into that different judgment. I wonder if you've got that. I wonder if you could find that if you don't have it. I wonder if you have evidence that you would classify as the same sort of thing. Yeah, this is an example of a person being a newcomer. This is another example of a person being a newcomer. Then maybe one really bugs you and one doesn't really bug you. Cool. That's great for this essay. Help us see why one bugs you and why one doesn't, and why you see them differently. Maybe in the same paragraph, maybe in paragraphs next to each other. I don't know. So here's all the stuff that I just wrote with you, all of the things. I'm going to be quiet for a second and just let you read through and kind of see how it fits when it's all together. But as you're reading, think about what I was doing. Think about that I didn't just randomly put these sentences here, that I was purposely thinking, all right, I got to get them into the issue. I got to have the top right. I got to have the thing, think about that. But let me be quiet while you read that. It's hard for me to judge how long this feels because it's not really on the page. It's not in my MLA format. Um, I do think it's possible that this paragraph will keep going with more evidence of informality in the same paragraph, as it kind of seems to be. Or it's possible that I'll cut it at but. But another might be my transition to the next paragraph in this section. So again, I know I keep saying this, but please feel free to use shorter paragraphs if you want. The key is that readers should always know where we're at. A key phrase like, but another example of informality is probably, makes it very clear to the reader, hey, we're still talking about that topic. So as long as we know where we're at, that's great. Maybe you even want to use like little section headings. Like maybe you even want to like have a bold section. Ways that these faculty are informal, and you have multiple paragraphs in that section. That's allowed. You can do that. Whatever will help me know where I'm at. Two things I want to point out here. I know I'm watching the clock. I know we don't have much more time, but one thing I noticed is that as I wrote this, I was almost instinctively, without meaning to, I was constantly referring back to things that readers already knew. I was doing that with pronouns. I was doing that with references to things that had already been said. And often those references back are in the beginning of my sentence. So I'm saying this because often students will talk to me about flow. They're like, Professor, I don't know if my writing flows well. Or I feel like I never know how to make my writing flow. And my answer is like, I think you mean like transitions and segues. The way to do that is with sentences like the things I just made pop up in yellow. Like, just look at it. As I observed, this group. Well, this is a pronoun referring back to something you already know about. This informality, the informality I just described. For example, an example of the thing I just told you about. Um, sorry, when I move my mouse, she said, she, the person I just referred to. Notice in the thing that I just quoted, that student, there's a pronoun again, that student-centered purpose, the student-centered purpose I just referred to. This faculty group, the faculty group that I've been talking about, it is the informality, I just mentioned it in my last sentence. That's what makes sentences feel smooth, is it's constant referencing back to what you just said and then saying something new about what you just said. A reference back and then a look forward. You can do that on purpose. You can build those into your sentences. One other thing I noticed as I wrote these is that, let me kind of go back and forth a couple times. Do you see in white and bold, there's 2 colons and 2 semicolons. I'm kind of making flash there. I noticed that I found myself using semicolons for, I think, the same reason that a number of you use comma splices. I've probably talked to 3/4 of you about the issue of comma splices. It's a really, really common issue in first year writing. Uh, what it is, it's when you have, it's a kind of run on when you have a sentence like this one over here. You have a sentence that it goes on and it feels like grammatically I should end this, but I've got more to say. So I feel like the beginning writer often just puts a comma right there. Like, I've got a whole sentence. This informality walks the line between a strength and a weakness, right? It could end there. It makes sense. And they just put a comma and then they write another sentence. And I get it. It makes sense because the two ideas are related. I'm talking about this informality. I have more to say about the thing I just said in the first sentence. The problem is that grammatically the comma isn't strong enough. Grammatically, you either need a period to be like, stop that thought, or what I often do is I use that semicolon. The semicolon says these are still connected ideas, but I they were I knew I needed more than a comma. It's just what I've just been saying. Notice that how to type it. It's the semicolon button and it's touching the word before it. I did it again over here. The only rule with the semicolon is that both sides have to be complete sentences. So in other words, she isn't being informal just for fun. That sounds like a sentence, right? There's a subject, there's a verb, it makes sense. If it doesn't have its own subject and verb and doesn't make sense on its own, then a semicolon is not an option. But if it is, if both sides work that way, then it's an option. That's a little different than a colon, like I said earlier, that kind of builds up to something. Build up, build up, build up, and then the answer. Build up, build up, build up, and then the answer. Okay, so quick takeaways. This is a formula. Yes, you might not always want to use it, but if you think about it flexibly, I think it might help you. The overall purpose of this formula is to never assume your evidence speaks for itself, to always be the writer who steps in and says, I will help you, reader. I will guide you through and tell you what I want you to notice. Like I said multiple times, it is your job to do this classifying and to order in a way that makes sense for a reader. I'm expecting you to do that work. That is one of the main things I want, is to see how you classify it and how you order it. In my first year STEM class today, I was using the example of when you make little mistakes with punctuation, little mistakes of how you introduce your quotes, it's almost like you went to a job interview with like a wrinkled shirt and wrinkled pants. Like, they might be like, well, you clearly have the qualifications for this job. You clearly, like, we could hire you, but what's up? Why do you look so sloppy? Or it's like if you forgot deodorant, right? If like, why do you kind of smell a little funny? Why do you kind of look like you didn't care much? That's what those problems with commas and things do. They don't ruin your whole message. Sure, I still understand your point if you mess that up, of course, but I understand it from the context of, why'd you make that silly little mistake? Um, I know it doesn't feel silly, but that's how it looks to readers a lot of times. And of course, like the last thing I said, smooth writing often refers back often. So that is all I have. Please do not come to class this week. I will not be there on Wednesday or Friday at 11. This is the only class. People who weren't here live, I'm expecting to watch this video. I'll put it online and I'll send an email out in a minute. That doesn't mean this conversation has to stop. If you want me to look at what you just wrote, if you want some more advice, before you turn in the drafts this Friday, let me know. But please do take this time, get your draft written, and I'll see you in a week or more than a week from now. That's all I got, so I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll stop the video. and I'll see you later. Thanks for being awesome. Appreciate it.